Welcome back to AP World History. This is Chapter 24, talking about industrialism and imperialism, how those two things went hand to hand. And that there's going to be a fundamental change, a shift during this period from simply trading, a commercial activity, to domination by the Western powers. And the British and the Dutch are going to lead the way. Typically, the British and the Dutch left the local traditions alone, but as time goes on, they're going to impose more and more of their culture on the locals. The Dutch probably were lesser an influence in Indonesia than the British were in India. Certainly, their language, if you wanted to be part of the government, you would have to learn English. And so the Indians who wanted to promotions, wanted to elevate themselves, would accept the British culture, the British language, so that they might advance. Um, Local rulers certainly were able to maintain administrative control, but directly under the European agent. And this was the government. At this time, they were the Dutch East India Company and also the British East India Company. The Europeans had to make adaptations. They had to adapt to the local cultures in the beginning to survive because they weren't used to the different diseases, the temperature, the climates, and they had to adjust their homes and clothing to fit their environment. And there are going to be Dutch and British settlers, mostly men, who come to the New World, or at least the Old World, Asia, Africa, India, and most of them had liaisons with local women, prostitutes. And this was a perfectly acceptable uh, social arrangement for the people living in these countries. Perhaps it would not have fit what the Victorian age would have demanded, but certainly the lack of women, there, as far as European women, European men will take on liaisons or prostitutes, and sometimes they would also marry these women. Eventually, the British and the Dutch begin to alter the social fabric. They bring their religion. Uh, to a lesser extent in India, the Protestants will come, but the Indians are going to be resistant to that, and also the Mongols, or not Mongols, but the uh, Muslims in Indonesia, to the Dutch rule. So religion, although it's the Christian faith is brought there, it doesn't make a lot of inroads, particularly in those two places. The British are going to see that their British East India Company becomes too corrupt, too much skimming off the top, and they're going to eventually kick them out and take over. Um, because of nabobs, these were the British who were cheating the Indians. They caused famine in Bengal. Cornwallis was largely responsible for reforming the British East India Company. Unfortunately, he also mistrustful of the Indians, so that set limitations on what he could do. But eventually, the British government will take over for the British East India Company. It shows the nabobs, or the English agents who were robbing the local businessmen in India. Um, Religious movements spilled out into the colonies, challenging but never really threatening the Hindu system. Evangelicals and Unitarians began to reform Indian practices. Um, but the British will always see the Indians as inferior. And the English language schools became a requirement for the upper class in the Indian society. This is the growth of the British Empire in India from 1750 to 1858. And as you can see, more and more of the country in blue is controlled by the British. And eventually all of this area will come under the control of the British. How do you justify colonial rule? There was a pseudoscience at that time called social Darwinism. Might makes right. The strong will always dominate the weak. The British and other European countries had a superior government, intellect, and therefore they should dominate people of lesser abilities. They were measuring skulls, and essentially the people of color were a little more primitive, and their skulls were never quite the match of the Europeans. So this was a moral justification for dominating people. In the long run, they would be better off to have white men telling them, showing them what to do. They were children, and their cultures were backward. This is the white man's burden. This shows the different European powers, wherever they went, carrying the natives on their back because they just weren't smart enough to take care of themselves. The white race is going to be supreme, and everyone else is going to be lower on the pecking order. Europeans lived separate from the natives. Laws restricted any kind of mixed marriages, although there were certainly liaisons, prostitutes. Occasionally there were Europeans who married natives, but most of the time they frowned upon this. This analyze a cartoon. Well, basically, you have to carry those poor people of color around because they're not smart enough for them if you don't. Changing social relations, scientific racism, social Darwinism, just simply believing that the white race was superior. One of the reasons they didn't want to have mixed marriages is because they thought it would pollute the white race and it would dumb it down. This little cartoon, if you want to take a look at it, the Tyrannosaurus Rex there, and kind of humorous. I thought I'd throw it in there because he destroys, and you can read this on your own. But essentially, might makes right. And then eventually, if you're questioned, well, you must be a communist. Industrial rivalries and the partitioning of the world. In the 19th century, of course, this is the 1800s, Great Britain dominated due to its powerful navy. Belgium, France, Germany, U.S. challenged the British control because they're going to build up their navy. Political, it certainly was intense rivalries for territory, and that equals power. The more territory you had, the more power you had. Everyone wants to have their own markets overseas so that they can make money in case there's a downturn in their own economy. Some see these colonies as social safety valves where people can go and settle if there's too many people in your home country. If there's unemployment, you can go to the colonies and seek work there. Certainly, there's going to be colonial wars and imperialism are sort of going to be wed together. The Europeans certainly were in fierce competition for different parts of the world, and they're going to start carving it up. One of the reasons that these people in Africa, India, and Asia are not able to resist, mainly because the white man has a superior technology, better navy, better guns, takes fewer of them to control many. So when you're fighting with spears and they have Gatling guns, there's just an uneven match. They were sometimes called tropical dependencies, and these were countries that were dependent to the mother country. And they had a small number of Europeans ruling over a large population. They had then settlement colonies. This is where Europeans came and settled in North America, Australia, New Zealand. to a certain extent in South Africa. Um, of course, the white race is going to dominate the locals. Java's model for India, India model for Africa and Asia. So they're going to exploit the divisions between the different rulers and then take over. European settlements mainly in large cities, and you have subordinates, the locals, to carry out the day-to-day routines. Major differences: higher education not promoted in Africa, language skills left to Christian missionaries. So this is a major difference between Africa and India and Asia. Method of economic extraction. Some things don't change. Western rulers helped by native subordinates. Almost in every colony, with the exception of Australia, New Zealand, and Americas, Canada. When you get to Asia, Africa, the locals are going to be a big help. The colonies become increasingly dependent on the mother country for the finished goods and also to sell their raw materials. And if you did not live up to the colonial expectations, certainly there was punishment. This was true when Belgium was controlling the Congo, such a small country controlling such a large area, and brutally, I might add, if you resisted. Early colonies vary widely. Early settlements impacted epidemic diseases, white man diseases. Particularly, you see this in the Pacific. Typically, the Europeans, when they came in contact with the Indians, the Africans, and the Chinese, they had already been exposed to these diseases. But in more remote areas, certainly the Americas and the Pacific, it's really going to have a devastating effect on the culture. Some places resist, others not so much. It just depends on the identity of the locals of that particular area. And we're going to stop right there.